welcome back to my channel, Mental Health with Melissa. If you're new here, I'm Melissa. I am a licensed clinical social worker, a clinical supervisor. I own a private practice, and I recently passed my defense for my dissertation for my PhD in psychology. So today, if you clicked on this video, please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button first and foremost. If you clicked on this video, then you are interested in learning a little bit more about therapy, the psychotherapy process, telehealth, which is virtual therapy versus in-person therapy. Now, I have done both. So pre-pandemic, I started my private practice in 2018. So that was like a full 2 years before everything really started to shift and change with like technology and virtual meetings and things like that. And I rented an office space where I started my practice and started seeing my first few clients. And so I have that experience, and then fast forward all the way to 2020 when everything started closing down and therapy really started to become like fully telehealth and virtual therapy to comply with those early social distancing measures. And as a result of those early social distancing measures, they have really changed and transitioned and affected the way that therapists do therapy and the way that we're able to really access maybe populations as therapists that we wouldn't have been able to access before. And our clients or people that are looking for therapy that may have not had the resources to get therapy before may have more of those resources. So today I am really going to debunk and demyth and look at some of the literature that talks about telehealth therapy or in-person therapy. Which one's better? Well, let's go ahead and get to it. I'm going to be referencing some notes because I did do a little bit of research and looked into some of the scholarly articles and evidence-based research that talks about what is better. So I'm going to be quoting a few different studies for you. So the first study that I just want to go ahead and get into it, was done by the authors Taolin et al. And it is entitled The Efficacy of Teletherapy versus In-Person Therapy, a Meta-Analysis of Randomized Clinical Trials. So in this particular study, what they found was that within group findings, teletherapy produced a symptom reduction of a large magnitude, and essentially found that there was no significant difference between teletherapy and in-person treatment outcomes at post-treatment. And so this is pretty important information because in this study they identified 1,393 studies in the initial search, and essentially again found that there wasn't a major difference between in-person versus virtual therapy, which leads to another study which is called the Systematic Review of Lessons Learned from Delivering Teletherapy to Veterans with Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder by the authors David Turgoose et al. And this is from 2018, so this was actually pre-pandemic. And I was really interested in reading this particular study because I have worked with veterans and worked with the VA before and was able to provide telehealth services, and that actually was a very good experience because you know, for those that weren't able to make it into clinic or anything like that, you know, we were able to do services remotely. So what they found in their systematic literature review from 41 papers was that in the majority of cases, teletherapy was found to be as effective in reducing PTSD symptoms as in-person interventions. And there were a few differences in most process outcomes, such as dropout rates with teletherapy helping to increase uptake in some cases. So this is really interesting information and kind of like connecting to this idea, like I mentioned, about being able to really reach maybe certain populations that might have a higher dropout rate because it's harder to get transportation to appointments, or it might cost money to travel a long distance, things like that. And a third study that I found, these authors, Annalise Giovannetti et al., and entitled Teletherapy versus In-Person Psychotherapy for Depression, a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. And essentially in this sort of study, they wanted to find out what the effectiveness is for each and if there is a difference. And they found that video-based teletherapy is feasible and an effective alternative to in-person services for reducing depressive symptoms. And essentially, continued research on effectiveness of telehealth in clinically depressed samples, and further education of the access barriers entailed by each delivery modality can help the field better determine which patients will derive the greatest benefit from each mode of intervention. So again, another article which really took into account a particular type of therapy. In the last article that I cited, it was PTSD for veterans, and this one is depression, and it seemed to be as effective. In an article entitled Zoom In to Zone Out, Therapists Report Less Therapeutic Skill in Telepsychology versus Face-to-Face Therapy During the COVID-19 Pandemic, by the authors Tao Lin et al., they essentially found that therapists perceive poor common therapeutic outcomes, decreased outcomes, and reduced extra therapeutic influence when conducting teletherapy compared to in-person therapy. Therapists who reported poor common therapeutic skills in teletherapy tended to be male, younger, utilize experience-based and relational therapies, have smaller caseloads, and had little training and no prior experience. So and they ended their research by saying more intensive training and support to these attribute skills are needed to improve therapists' confidence and ability to use therapy and teletherapy. So this seems to have applied to a very specific type of therapist, but I thought it would still be important to add that, even though it had different sorts of findings than some of the other articles that I cited. And lastly, I want to cite one more article because there's just so much evidence-based literature about this right now, especially because it's so timely. And so there's much more that you could look into if you're interested, but I'm just going to cite one more and then have a little bit more of a conversation about it. This is entitled Clients' Perceptions of Changes in Their Therapist's Positive Regard and Transitioning from In-Person Therapy to Teletherapy. And it's by the authors Barry Farber and Daisy Ort. So in this particular study, they found a total of 2,118 clients, predominantly white, female, heterosexual, and in their 20s, who had been working with their therapist for an average of 20 months in person and 5 months in teletherapy, and completed a Perceptions of Psychotherapy process scale. And what they found was that despite the challenges of an abrupt shift to teletherapy, clients perceive their therapist as communicating PR, like I care about you, perceptions of change, positive regard, to the same or even slightly higher degrees as compared to in-person therapy pre-pandemic. And ultimately, therapists and clients have seemingly adapted to the new demands of technology to preserve important elements of the therapeutic relationship. So there you have it. There are the cited actual literature and scholarly works that go into detail about, is it better or worse to have in-person virtual therapy? It seems like the majority of the information tells us that there isn't too much of a difference, and in some articles it sounds like actually having access to virtual therapy was really helpful for some populations that might have more no-show rates due to barriers to getting to their appointments in person. And so I'm curious to know with you, whether you're a therapist or whether you are somebody that receives therapy or both, what do you prefer? Put it down in the comment section below because I'm really curious to know. As for me, I have transitioned to doing complete 100% virtual therapy, and this is something that is definitely a lifestyle change for me as well, because when I was renting an office, it meant that I had to factor in commute time to the office. I had to pay extra for renting the office space, and also I needed to make sure that my clients were able to make it. If they were, I had to assess them and make sure that they were essentially safe to meet with in person. But now that I do all virtual therapy from home, I've cut out the cost, of course, of paying for or renting an office space, and I save a lot more time because that means I don't have to commute. I essentially just wake up and walk into my office, and also that allows me to take on either an extra client or two with the time that I would be commuting, or I'm able to use that time that I would have been commuting and use it for self-care or to sleep in an extra hour, which is just so amazing, and ultimately I think helps the client process because that gives me a little bit more of that downtime and self-care. I will say on the downside, having so much access to virtual therapy, sometimes, to be completely transparent with you, it makes me lose my sight of boundaries a little bit in terms of I feel like that I can accept more clients when really maybe I shouldn't accept more clients, but because I'm like, oh, I have, all this free time that I'm saving from commuting and not being in an office space, that I might take more on. And so I have to be, very self-aware and think about that and have insight about that so that I don't get too burnt out, because I have done that in the past and that's something that I am working on. But again, I am interested to hear more about you all and what your experience is with that, whether again you be the client or the therapist or both. Anyway, I hope this video was informational enough for you. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section down below. Until next time, managing mental health matters.